It begins with a sound many East Africans still remember from old radio broadcasts, that quiet but sharp alert tone signaling that something serious has just happened. For most people in Kenya and Uganda, warnings of war belong to another generation, a darker era of political quarrels and battles no one wants to relive. Yet suddenly, after decades of uneasy peace, that sound feels real again. Just days ago, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda stood before his supporters and declared something no one expected to hear in 2025, that the Indian Ocean belongs to Uganda and that in the future there could be wars over it. For older Americans watching Africa closely, this moment feels like a page pulled straight from Cold War geopolitics. A landlocked nation, a powerful longtime ruler seeking re-election, a vital sea route, and a statement loud enough to shake the region. Museveni is preparing for his 8th presidential term since taking power in 1986. And as he unveiled his new manifesto, he spoke of Uganda's frustrations, the endless negotiations with Kenya over pipelines, railways, customs, and fuel imports. But when he declared, "That ocean belongs to me, and in the future we are going to have wars," the room fell silent. And across East Africa, hearts tightened. In Kenya, ordinary families began asking the same question Americans are beginning to ask today. Is this just campaign rhetoric, or the opening line of a deeper regional crisis? Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has tried to calm the storm, saying Museveni understands international law and Kenya's territorial rights. But experts warn that these words could strain an already fragile East African community, one where access to the Indian Ocean means survival, leverage, and power. So here is the question for all of us, especially those in America who understand how fast a misunderstanding can ignite a conflict. Is East Africa moving toward unity, or are we witnessing the first cracks of something far more dangerous? If you believe Africa's rising geopolitical shifts matter for America, for global trade, and for the future of stability, stay with us. Please share this video if you want truth beyond the headlines, and subscribe if you want to be among the first to understand Africa as it really is. In the early morning hours in Kampala, when shopkeepers are just lifting their metal shutters and schoolchildren begin their long walks down dusty roads, most Ugandans aren't thinking about the Indian Ocean. They're thinking about fuel prices, electricity outages, and the long list of daily struggles that have defined life for decades. Yet, without warning, their president, a man who has ruled for nearly 40 years, placed the distant sea at the center of national politics. President Yoweri Museveni, now preparing for his 8th consecutive term in office, had gathered supporters for what was supposed to be a routine unveiling of his new political manifesto. The room was filled with party loyalists, elderly veterans from his rebel days, and young Ugandans who have never known another leader. Museveni looked tired, moving slowly, speaking more softly than he once did, and perhaps because of that, people expected the usual message: stability, security, continuity. But instead, he reached for something much more provocative, something that stunned Uganda, Kenya, and even far beyond East Africa. He began by describing what he called the Russian-style disorganization of African borders, how colonial lines left some nations with coastlines and others without. Then, with growing frustration, he moved into the heart of the matter: Uganda's dependence on Kenya for nearly everything that must come from the sea. Railways, pipelines, customs clearances, negotiations that drag on for years. "How do I export my products?" he asked the crowd. "Why must we depend endlessly on Kenya's decisions?" The room grew quiet. Supporters leaned forward. And then suddenly, he said the words that would dominate headlines for days. "That ocean belongs to me. In the future, we are going to have wars." It was an extraordinary statement, not only because Uganda is landlocked, but because war between Kenya and Uganda is something almost unimaginable in today's East Africa. Yet, Museveni didn't retreat. His tone was not joking, not metaphorical. He was speaking to a core national frustration: the vulnerability of being cut off from the sea in a region where maritime access means wealth, sovereignty, and survival. To understand the weight of this moment, it's important to remember Uganda's recent legal battles. In December 2023, Uganda took Kenya to the East African Court of Justice, accusing Nairobi of blocking its state-owned oil company from importing fuel through Mombasa. For months, trucks waited at borders, fuel prices surged, and tempers flared. The dispute was resolved only in July 2024 when Uganda's first direct petroleum shipment finally arrived, a victory, but a fragile one. That fragility is what Museveni tapped into. Back in Nairobi, the reaction was instant, but remarkably measured. Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs avoided escalating the situation. A spokesperson reaffirmed Kenya's understanding of international territorial law, reminding the public and perhaps reminding Museveni that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea already guarantees Uganda the right to access the ocean via Kenyan territory. He knows this well, the spokesperson said, implying that Museveni's statement was political, not literal. But experts across the region were far less diplomatic. Security analysts called the remarks absurd, dangerous, and deeply irresponsible. They reminded East Africans that Uganda's past wars, especially the Mutukula conflict and the Saba clashes with Tanzania, left deep scars. Another war, especially with a close neighbor, would be catastrophic. Still, to many observers, Museveni wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for an election. And he was speaking directly to Ugandans who feel trapped by geography, who believe their country is limited not by lack of talent or ambition, but by a border drawn long before they were born. He was telling them he sees their frustration. He was telling them he is still the man who can fight for them. Whether his words were a warning, a threat, or a campaign tactic, one thing became clear: Museveni had opened a door that cannot be easily closed. Long before the politicians spoke and before newspapers published their headlines, ordinary Kenyans were the first to feel the tremor. In coastal towns like Mombasa and Malindi, fishermen mending their nets paused when they heard Museveni's words circulating on local radio. "That ocean belongs to me. In the future, we are going to have wars. To them, the sea is not politics. It is food work, heritage, and survival." The idea of a regional leader laying claim to it was enough to make the air feel heavier. And that is when the story reached its Trao, the emotional peak where seriousness could no longer be denied. The moment Museveni invoked future wars, the entire region entered a state of alert. Memories of the old conflicts that once consumed East Africa began resurfacing, conflicts many hoped were sealed away in history. In Uganda, the president's supporters erupted in applause, interpreting his statement as a bold assertion of national pride. Young people, many unemployed, many frustrated with their country's economic dependency, said the president was finally expressing what they had long felt but were never allowed to say publicly. "We need the sea to survive," one Kampala youth declared on a street interview. "We can't keep begging Kenya." But for older Ugandans, those who lived through the Mutukula clashes and saw families displaced during the Saba War of 1977, Museveni's words felt chilling. They had buried relatives, rebuilt homes, and lived through years of fear. To them, war is not a political metaphor. It is a memory soaked in pain. Across the border, Kenya's reaction was immediate, but not explosive. Government officials understood exactly how dangerous it would be to respond emotionally. Instead, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a calm, measured statement. They reminded the world that Museveni knows international territorial law well and that Kenya retains full sovereign control over its coastline. They didn't insult him, didn't escalate, they chose diplomacy over confrontation. Yet outside official channels, Kenyans were angry. Many took to online platforms questioning why their president should tolerate even the slightest suggestion of war. Business owners, truck drivers, and port workers, all deeply connected to the Mombasa trade route, demanded reassurance. They know that if Kenya and Uganda ever reached a breaking point, it would be the people, not the politicians, who would suffer first. Security experts across East Africa added fuel to the growing debate. They described Museveni's statement as deeply dangerous, pointing out that it arrived at the height of election season, the time when leaders are most likely to make provocative promises. Analysts emphasize that landlocked nations often feel marginalized in regional trade systems, but invoking war crosses a line that cannot be ignored. One expert put it bluntly: landlocked frustration is real, but the idea of claiming another country's ocean is irrational and destabilizing. The conversation then expanded to include the fragile history between Uganda and Kenya. Although the two nations have maintained cooperative relations for decades, underlying tensions occasionally surface, especially around cross-border resources like Migo Island. Their July 30, 2025 fisheries agreement was intended to reduce pressure, but Museveni's new remarks reopened old fears. Was Uganda dissatisfied with the deal? Was the island dispute truly settled? Was this just the beginning of a louder territorial claim? Politicians within Uganda's opposition seized the moment. They accused Museveni of provoking fear to secure his last term, arguing that he was using the ocean, a body of water his country does not border, as a symbol to distract from domestic economic problems. They warned that such rhetoric could alienate Kenya-Uganda's most important transit partner and harm millions of citizens. Meanwhile, international observers watched with growing concern. Kenya is the logistical backbone of the region, and Uganda depends on it for 90% of its refined petroleum. A rhetorical conflict today could become an economic crisis tomorrow. And so the region found itself suspended between applause and fear, between nationalist pride and haunting memories of past wars. The political theater had reached its peak, and though the words were spoken in a moment of campaign intensity, their echo stretched across borders, stirring emotions that East Africa thought it had left behind. In border towns like Busia and Malaba, where trucks stretch for miles and families depend entirely on the flow of goods between Kenya and Uganda, Museveni's remarks landed like a silent earthquake. Shopkeepers looked up from their counters. Truck drivers exchanged long, uncertain glances. Mothers carrying bags of maize paused mid-stride. They understood something that distant politicians often forget. Even one reckless statement can ripple through the lives of millions who depend on the stability of East Africa's trade corridor. The first and most immediate consequence of Museveni's words was economic fear. Uganda relies on Kenya's port of Mombasa for nearly all its refined petroleum, about 90%. Whenever political tensions rise, the fear is always the same. What if Kenya slows down transit? What if fuel prices surge again? Ugandans remember December 2023 when a legal dispute between the two nations led to delays in fuel imports. Prices spiked. Transport costs doubled. Families rationed gas. When Museveni floated the possibility of future wars, even if only rhetorically, truck companies and fuel distributors quietly began calculating the financial risks. They know how fragile the supply chain is and how quickly it can collapse. For ordinary citizens, the chain reaction is painfully predictable: higher fuel prices, higher food prices, higher transportation costs, fewer jobs. In places like Gulujinja and Mbale, where families already live day to day, even a small disruption can push thousands closer to poverty. And to many older Ugandans, the memory of wartime scarcity is never far away. On the Kenyan side, the consequences are equally serious. Kenya depends heavily on Ugandan transit fees, cross-border trade, and the steady movement of goods that sustain Mombasa's economy. If tensions escalate, businesses in the port city would face reduced volumes, delayed shipments, and uncertainty that could scare away international partners. Kenya's role as the region's logistical backbone would come under pressure, and competing ports in Tanzania or even Somalia could seize the opportunity. But beyond economics lies something much deeper: the political future of the East African Community, EAC. EAC has spent years attempting to build a unified regional market, shared infrastructure, shared trade policies, smoother borders. That dream depends entirely on trust, and trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. Museveni's comments about ownership of the Indian Ocean struck at the heart of that trust. Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan, Burundi, all members of the EAC immediately saw the danger. If one member state can challenge another's territorial sovereignty so casually, what does that mean for the long-term stability of the Union? Could this spark broader territorial anxieties? Could old disputes resurface? Political analysts warn that Museveni's remarks may embolden other frustrated actors across the region. Landlocked countries elsewhere, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Rwanda, have publicly raised concerns about dependence on neighbors for port access. The fear is that one leader's rhetoric could legitimize a dangerous trend, rewriting regional cooperation through threats instead of diplomacy. And then there is the domestic political cost. Within Uganda, opposition groups seized on the moment to argue that Museveni is out of touch with the realities of modern East Africa. They accuse him of sacrificing diplomatic relationships for campaign applause. They say he is risking Uganda's economic lifeline to distract from unemployment, corruption, and the high cost of living. Their message resonates especially in urban centers, where frustration toward long-term rule has grown sharper in recent years. Meanwhile, civil society organizations warn that careless talk of war could inflame nationalist tensions among young people who have no memory of past conflicts. They worry that emotional rhetoric amplified by social media can harden public attitudes and narrow the space for peaceful dialogue. In the end, the greatest consequence may be the simplest one. Museveni's words broke the illusion that East Africa's peace is guaranteed. For millions of ordinary people whose lives depend on cross-border harmony, that illusion was their security. At dawn in Mombasa, before the heat rises off the Indian Ocean, American sailors stationed on visiting naval vessels often jog along the port's quiet perimeter roads. They may not know it, but the waters beside them, calm blue, seemingly ordinary, have suddenly become the center of one of East Africa's most sensitive political storms. From Washington's perspective, Museveni's statement wasn't just an African domestic quarrel. It was a shift in the region's geopolitical temperature. For the United States, the Kenyan port of Mombasa is more than a regional trade hub. It is a strategic artery, a gateway into the Indian Ocean, a checkpoint in the global security architecture that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Suez Canal and down into the Cape of Good Hope. Any instability here has ripple effects on American military logistics, counterterrorism operations, and maritime trade routes. That is why Museveni's declaration, "The ocean belongs to me." In the future, we are going to have wars caught Washington's attention. In a world already strained by conflicts in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Red Sea, the last thing American policymakers want is a new fault line in East Africa. Particularly not between Kenya, a long-standing U.S. security partner, and Uganda, a key contributor to regional peacekeeping efforts. From America's point of view, the danger is twofold. First, a diplomatic rupture between Kenya and Uganda could fracture the East African community at a time when unity is essential. Washington views regional blocs like the EAC as stabilizing forces, buffers against terrorism, organized crime, and foreign interference. Second, any weakening of regional cohesion could open the door wider for China. Beijing already funds major railway, port, and road projects in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. If Nairobi and Kampala drift apart politically, China could move in more aggressively, offering infrastructure security cooperation or financial leverage that shifts the region's balance of power away from the West. Meanwhile, European governments are also watching closely. The EU relies heavily on East African trade routes for agricultural goods, minerals, and manufactured products. Instability threatens supply chains that feed into Europe's industrial economy. Brussels fears that tensions could push Uganda or other EAC members to pursue unilateral deals with non-Western powers, weakening Europe's influence. The African Union, too, faces a moment of truth. AU leaders understand that if Museveni's rhetoric is left unchecked, it could normalize territorial claims by other landlocked nations. Ethiopia has expressed frustration over Djibouti's control of port access. South Sudan remains dependent on Mombasa and Port Sudan. Rwanda relies on Tanzania's Dar es Salaam port. A single rhetorical spark can ignite broader ambitions. And layered beneath all this is the deeper story of Africa's rising assertiveness. Across the continent, leaders like Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso have redefined the language of sovereignty, independence, and regional power. The world has taken notice. So when Museveni framed Uganda's maritime frustration in near-military terms, some global observers read it not as a threat, but as part of a larger continental shift, Africa demanding space, voice, and equal treatment on the world stage. To older American viewers, the message is clear. East Africa is not drifting quietly. It is becoming one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions, a place where words can move markets and where a single political statement can redraw alliances. As the dust settles on this unfolding diplomatic storm, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. A single sentence from a single president has exposed just how fragile peace can be in East Africa. Ordinary people, fishermen along the Kenyan coast, truck drivers at the Uganda border, mothers selling vegetables in Kampala, now find themselves living under the weight of a political echo they never asked for. They don't want war. They don't want hostility. They want stability, fuel that arrives on time, food that stays affordable, and neighbors who remain neighbors, not adversaries. Museveni's words may have been spoken in the heat of a political campaign, but the meaning they carried was far bigger than any election. They reminded the region and the world that landlocked frustration, economic dependency, and territorial sensitivity can combine into a dangerous formula if leaders choose confrontation over cooperation. They also revealed a deeper vulnerability inside the East African community, the illusion that unity is guaranteed simply because borders are open and trade agreements are signed. But unity is not a document. It is a daily choice. And when a leader hints at future wars, even hypothetically, that choice becomes harder for millions who already live close to the edge of economic uncertainty. This moment should be a wake-up call, not only for East Africa, but for the international community, especially the United States. America has long relied on Kenya as a strategic ally and Uganda as a security partner. If these two nations fracture, the consequences will travel far beyond their borders. Trade routes will shift, alliances will reshape, outside powers will step in. And the region's growing movement for sovereignty from the Sahel to the Indian Ocean will take on new unpredictable forms. Across Africa today, a new generation of leaders is redefining independence, responsibility, and national dignity. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore has become a symbol of this shift, a reminder that Africa's future will be defined by leaders who build, not threaten, who negotiate, not provoke, who stand firm without destabilizing their neighbors. His name now appears often in global Africa news precisely because he represents a different path: sovereignty without aggression. So here's the question I want to leave with you, especially to my American viewers over 60 who have lived through enough geopolitical crises to recognize the early signs of change. Is East Africa heading toward a stronger union or toward a silent fracture that the world won't notice until it is too late? And more importantly, should global powers, including the United States, engage more seriously before tensions escalate beyond rhetoric? Your voice matters in this conversation. Please share this video if you believe that truth should travel faster than fear, and subscribe if you want to be among the first to understand Africa's rise, President Ibrahim Traore's impact, and the future of Africa news beyond the headlines.